Hello, and a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Fay Bjayou, and you're listening to the mentalwealth.me podcast, where we discuss all things related to neuroscience and psychology. Professor Joseph Ferrari, we are thrilled to have you with us on Mental Wealth, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Please call me Deacon Joe. We can be a little more informal.
Deacon Joe.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. You are an internationally recognized expert in chronic procrastination and clutter. So today we're here to talk about clutter, of course. And when does mess qualify as clutter? And what are the fundamental differences between clutter and hoarding?
Thank you. Yes, that's where I wanted to start on those points. Thank you for having me here today. I hope this brings some comfort and some direction for your listeners. When we talk about clutter, what exactly does it mean? It can be disorganization, and that's usually how it's framed. Now, you asked a good question, but by clutter, we're talking about something that's different than hoarding. Hoarding is a psychiatric disorder. And with hoarding, like clutter, there is a useless or limited value items. But with hoarding, you tend to have much of the same items as vertical and one is horizontal. Toilet paper, toilet paper, toilet paper, toilet paper. Magazine, 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 magazine. Right. So the person has lots of those items. Where clutter, it's more horizontal. It's breadth, all right? You have overabundance of items. In both cases, it's distressful. It impairs on your ability to function, all right? But there is a significant difference. Now, I do most of my research with a colleague named Catherine Roster, Dr. Roster. Okay. She's an IO consumer psychologist, actually. She's someone who focuses on items that people consume. And she's from the University of New Mexico. Okay. And so when Roster and I define clutter, we'd call it an overabundance of possessions. Right. That collectively are chaotic and lead to a disorderly living space. Now, our first major paper came out in 2016, and I have now probably about 14, I haven't counted more recently, but a large number of publications since then. Because this is interestingly not a large body of scholarly research as to what is clutter and what impact does it have on our lives until Dr. Roster and I really joined forces. Now, how did we meet and how did we even get into this? And this is really great timing. You're talking to me on the 19th of September, and tomorrow starts an international conference for decluttering coaches.
Fantastic.
Yes, in Bloomington, Minnesota. Annually, there's an organization called the Institute for Challenging Disorganization, ICD. And they hold an annual meeting for decluttering coaches. And Roster and I have partnered with them. Now, notice the title, the Institute of Challenging Disorganization. The word clutter isn't there. Yeah. Because for decluttering coaches, clutter is a disorganization problem. The first thing they will tell you to do is not run out and buy a big tub and put stuff in there. Instead, organize and look to see what you have. According to decluttering coaches, the three areas people have the most clutter is in the home. This would be the closet, the kitchen, and bookshelves. All right. So what they would tell you to do is go in your closet and organize it. Wow. I've got 15 pairs of blue pants. Wow. I've got 7 blouses of the same color or shirts. Wow. 6 spatulas, 8 spatulas. So they would tell you to organize. And then we'll talk about some of the other advice they have. But I want to lay the groundwork here for the listener that this is a disorganization issue, at least based on these professional declutterers from ICD. So that's how they view that. When Roster and I look at clutter, we measure it by using the Clutter Quality of Life Scale. This is a measure we created with the ICD members. The Clutter Quality of Life Scale. It's a self-assessment, has 18 items, and it looks at clutter's consequences impacting 4 areas of your life. Livability of space.
Yes.
How does it impact your livability? Does it cause you distress? And what emotional responses do you have? Something people don't often think about is, Does the clutter have an impact on the relationship with others that you have?
Sure.
And then again, something else not often talked about is the financial well-being. Is it costing you lots of money? Now, here in the United States, for example, U.S. citizens have over $7,000 worth of stuff, clutter that they do not use in their home. So what's fascinating to me is that people are claiming, they live credit card to credit card and they don't have money. Well, they're buying all these items that they don't need. And again, and at least here in this country, you have home shopping networks. I don't know if you have
Absolutely.
them. Okay, so now you don't have to leave your home. You can sit there on the couch with your clicker and say, I want that. And in fact, we're going to ship it to you tomorrow for free. So think about this. People are buying and buying, and we're going to make easy payments for all of this. So we have we have a culture. We have I can't think of the word, when a society has a new implementation of
consumer-driven society, I would say.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And it's making it's making it easy. So of course, they're not going to like hearing what I have to say, but then we wonder why people don't have money.
Of course.
Because what's happened is we've taken our wants and we've made them needs. Things that we don't have to have. We hear from others, we see on these shows that, oh no, your life is not quite good enough. You're not good enough unless you have this item. And just imagine how much better your life will be. See? So we have this notion that what I might want now becomes a have to have. Well, you have to have air, you have to have water, but you don't need the latest iPhone. That's nice to have,
Absolutely.
But you don't have to have.
Oh, I think this consumer-driven society as well has also enabled us to put more value on material possessions, which obviously becomes a problem inherently, because
Correct.
The more that you are, putting your focus on possessions, the more you are accumulating. So have you seen the situation get much worse in the recent years, especially post-pandemic?
There's no longitudinal study to address that.
Yeah.
Can't. We've only started since 2016, 2017,
right.
Which is before the pandemic, but I haven't seen necessarily, no. ICD coaches, these decluttering coaches, their business is steady. In fact, I'll talk a little bit about that, but you raise an interesting point there, because one of the interests that I have is the meaning of home. And it's called psychological home. I'm a social community psychologist. Most people think of psychologists as clinical. And I know this series is on mental health.
Yes.
I'm not a clinician. But as a social community psychologist, I'm interested in our social structures and how do they impact our lives. Yes. And one of the concepts that I'm particularly interested in is this psychological home, yes, which is different than a house. Right? We say, I travel, can't wait to go home. You eat me out of house and home. Sure. Whenever we're together, that's my home. So there's something more than that. It's interesting. We still have a politically, at least in the States here, a politically incorrect expression, homeless. Well, yes. These people aren't less because they don't have a home. So the more correct word that you may be hearing more and more is unhoused. All right. Unhoused. Yes, they're unhoused, but they're not less because they don't have a home. And, I introduced myself as Deacon Joe, and I believe in my Christian faith that we all have a home with God. So they aren't homeless. Yes. So if you think about that, how inappropriate that is and how insulting. Okay, so I'm interested in psychological home, that sense of I'm at home. Sure. And these days with migrants and people moving, how are they finding home? I have a body of literature. I've been looking at that in terms of what impact. The bottom line is, back to clutter, is that the more clutter you have, the lower your sense of home. So that's fascinating. So yes. Here we have this culture of consumerism, as you point out, and we're actually finding an inverse relationship. The more clutter, the lower home sense you have. So that's kind of interesting. You're not gaining a stronger sense of home. We've done work on clutter in the home and clutter in the office. And right now, as a grad student, I just finished a paper on digital, e-waste, electronic waste clutter.
Yeah.
People buy electronics and it just stores around. You've got monitors and mice and wires and on average, at least in the United States, Americans have 3 old used cell phones, mobile phones that they don't use. So what's happening to all that electronic waste, or e-waste as we call it? And we've been looking at how people recycle it and what they do with that. That's another interest of community psychologists, sustainability and climate control. This summer in Italy, I gave a keynote looking at my work on e-waste and stuff. All right. So if you don't mind, I'm going to talk about what are some of the psychological consequences of clutter and why is it hard to declutter?
Yes.
Can I go into those areas for you?
Absolutely. Please do.
Okay.
Yes.
What are some of the psychological consequences of clutter? Well, again, what we're finding is people have a low psychological well-being. So they feel more stressed, they feel with more clutter, right? So think higher clutter, you have more stress, higher rates of procrastination, all right, and higher rates of indecision. One of the areas I study is decisional procrastination. Another name for that is indecisiveness, indecision. So the people tend to be indecisive. Now, these are correlations. So you can't say indecision is making them have clutter. The clutter is making them indecisive. We can just simply say, and I'm sure your listeners are familiar, that these two correlate. Yes. More mood disorders. People with more clutter are reporting less happiness, less joy in their life. Negative emotions about the self. This is some of Roster's interest, is how, in terms of buying items and how do they reflect our identity. There's a body of literature in consumer psych on how items are self-extensions of the self. Those are things we buy are ways to reflect who we are. All right, well, we're finding that people are reporting negative emotions and negative views of themselves. I haven't done this study, but Roster came across a study that we haven't done this, that there's an overconsumption of unhealthy foods by people who have lots of clutter. And that makes sense because I'm sorry to use the stereotype, but think of the couch potato. Absolutely. They're sitting there watching those shopping networks and they're just eating junk food. Sure. Lower quality of life. All right. We're finding that people who have more clutter is basically not happy. So it's different than hoarding, circling back to that, which is a psychiatric disorder, has been diagnosed, and but clutter hasn't reached that point yet. And yet, so maybe that's why people are having more and more clutter, because they don't see, it's not a psychological problem. It's okay. Well, it's not.
But Deacon Joe, where does one draw the line with that? So how can one definitively say you are cluttering or you're hoarding?
That's a great question. Don't have the answer. What's the tipping point you're asking? When does it cross the line?
Exactly.
Yeah. But have to leave that to my hoarding colleagues, people like Randy Frost, who I think you've had on your show.
Absolutely.
Good friend.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would suggest ask Randy. I don't know if he answered that, but I don't, that's kind of a question that the hoarders, because they're the ones who go look at the extreme cases.
For sure.
So why is it hard to declutter? All right. If you don't mind, I'll go through a few reasons.
Please.
Because items may be emotionally stressful. To use the word people like to use, it might be a trigger to the past. Now, it doesn't have to be only negative emotion. It could be positive. So you have this item in your home and you would like to get rid of it. But when you pick it up, it reminds you maybe the good times you had. Oh, that was that trip. Oh, that was my good friend. Oh, da, 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 da. Okay. Yeah. So there might be a trigger to something emotional and that's stressful for you because it brings back memories you don't want to. That could be positive, could be negative. You pick it up and, oh, that reminds me of that horrible trip. Oh, that was that person I didn't care for in my life. So you put it down. All right. So one reason it's hard because it may be emotionally stressful.
A quick question, though. Why do we develop a strong emotional attachment to these objects? Are you able to elaborate a bit more on that?
I would say you got to look at the self-identification of objects. Going back to what I said, Roster and consumer psychologists look at. We identify with objects. We make things express who we are. More and more in our age of technology. It's all about how many likes I have. I have to have that expensive meal. I can't afford it, but I got to take pictures of it to show people. This is things that I have.
Validation.
We're going to go to the Great Wall of China. Can't afford it, but I got to get a picture there. So see, I'm important.
Sure.
I think that's all part of the issues. There may be, going back to this, there may be multiple users and decision makers that are involved with the item.
Yes.
In other words, it may not be up to me solely to decide to get rid of it. And then when I say this, it always reminds me, my wife and I have been married for 38 years, and this has been a good 40 years ago. I still remember. I was helping her move from one apartment to the other. And I remember picking up a thing that to me looked like a toothpick holder. All right. And some crystal thing. And I said, oh, we don't need this. Oh, did it cause a fight? That's important to me. It isn't up to you. And it wasn't, I think she told me, no, it wasn't a toothpick holder. It was a salt shaker or something like that.
Yeah.
To me, because it wasn't my place. It wasn't my decision. See? So we think it's up to us to get rid of it, but there may be others that are involved. And so it may cause potential conflict.
Absolutely.
So I'm not going to get rid of it. I'm just going to leave it. And the last set of reasons I call lacks. Go ahead, ask your question.
No, which obviously causes, relation to personal strains.
Exactly.
Because, you're living in a situation where the person is having to justify you're wanting to throw it. And so nothing is done, really. So it is very difficult. And from personal experience, it's difficult to live with individuals who insist upon keeping certain things that you cannot rationalize. One really needs your help, Deacon Joe, on what to do moving forward, which we'll get to later, on how to remedy that and how to help that situation.
Pick and choose would be that. So pick your battle, fine. You want to keep it small, you can keep your salt shaker. Okay. But maybe it's this bigger item. But anyway, the three lacks. People often say, I lack time, I lack the resources, or I lack the ability. This is why it's hard to declutter. Well, let's pick those apart. Let's break open each of them. Lack of time. People will often say as a plausible excuse, and remember, human beings, we're great excuse makers. We always have a reason. That's a whole nother body of research. But lack of time.
Sure.
I would declutter if I only had the time. I'm just so busy. I can't get to that. Well, this is fascinating because during COVID, everybody was locked down. We had to stay in our homes. We couldn't go anyplace. So Roster and I decided, let's contact the Decluttering ICD leadership and ask them about, are people now going through drawers and closets during COVID? So we did a Zoom meeting with them, and they laughed and they said, no, our business isn't increasing. People are not. It's a misperception. The media finds the one or two people who might be out there emptying out their closets, but that's not most people. So even though people had the time, we didn't see decluttering increase. That's fascinating. And then she and I just published a paper about, and I'll talk about them, the types of declutterers based on our data that we collected.
Interesting. So they've been categorized.
Yeah, there are three different kinds, if you would. Yes.
Okay.
Lack of resources. People often say, I'd love to declutter, but I just don't know what to do with it. I don't know, how to get rid of these things. Another excuse that people have, because a lot of people will say, and I think this is true, my family doesn't want it. I want to give these to my kids, and they really don't want the item. And I know that because I have 3 adult children. They don't always want our things. But then I say, but there are families who don't have things. Right. In the news, you just read about the family whose house has burned down, or you read about the unfortunate bombings and disasters that are happening, and people have nothing. So maybe your kids don't want the china, but there's another family who would love it. So in other words, create a legacy, pay it forward, give it to somebody else who can use it. Maybe yours can't. Now, some people here in the States, they will go to Goodwill, or maybe you've had things called Salvation Army. I'm okay with that kind of, because there's also a lot of other people who will go to those shops, buy the item for $2 or $3, and then try to resell it online for $20. They make it a business. They find these what are really good things. And I don't want to do that, because that's not the point of putting it low in those shops. So they're really to help people who need it, not people who want to rip off the system. But lack of resources, I think you can find the resources. By the way, speaking of lack of resources and don't know what to do with it, my wife has a clever strategy she does around the Christmas holidays. She will gently give each of our children something in the house, all right, and buy that's gently used, and something related that's new. So one slow way to declutter is to give them that. Every time the kids would come to visit, because our children live in out of the area, they would have to bring something from their room back. They don't visit much anymore. That's hard. But anyway, lack of ability. All right. People would often say, I'd love to declutter, but I just don't know what to do. Now that introduces the ICD decluttering coaches. Now, the decluttering coaches suggest you, of course, they say, hire them. I don't know if you necessarily have to, although it's not a bad idea, but you may not have the resources, the money. So instead, bring other people in that, like a friend. I want to talk about, because it's linked to this, the popular, there was a Netflix series on it, the popular expression, keep it if it brings you joy. Have you ever heard of that expression?
Yes, of course.
Well, I'm not going to mention who. Okay, that's incorrect on a number of angles. And that's why can I go through that? Because it's kind of lack of.
Yes, please.
Touch it and keep it if it gives you joy. Well, first of all, touch it. All right. So what roster and consumer psychologists would tell you is no, don't touch it. Why? Because scholars have found if you go to the store and you pick something up and you hold it, you're more likely to buy it. You're more likely to keep it. That is why retailers will pay extra premium to have their items in grocery stores or stores in the middle eye level so people can see it, so they can pick it up and hold it. So if you pick it up, research says don't touch it. The decluttering coaches, these professionals who deal with this, would tell you no, because if you hold that pair, one of those 15 pairs of blue pants, you're more likely to keep it. Instead, they claim bring one of them in. I say, or bring in a good friend and let them hold the pants. Yes. And look at it and say, do you really need 15? Can you live with 5? Would 7 be enough? So if you touch it.
So could one, forgive me, Deacon Joe, could one rephrase that? So instead of keep it if it brings you joy, keep it if it's useful.
Useful? Well, I'm going by the expression that was popularized. Keep it if it gives you joy.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's my philosophy, though. Keep it if it's useful.
If it's useful. And if you, yes. And the question is, do you need it?
Yes.
You raise an interesting point. Then I'll get back to that expression if you'd like. For a number of years, I would be partnering with a decluttering coach, one of these ICD people, and she and I would go to parishes. I'm a Catholic deacon, and so they're Catholic parishes, and we would talk. We had a series of talks that what was it? Clutter ain't Christian, stuff ain't saintly. And so we would go through, and I would talk about what does the Bible tell us in terms of holding on to things. Because, if I may, if I don't mean to offend your listeners, but if I may,
of course.
Okay, Christ never said be a pauper. Christ never said have nothing.
Sure.
Christ just said don't be attached to it. Don't place it above what's important in life, which is your relationship with a higher power, God. All right, that's
very interesting.
Yes, it's not abundance; it's attachment. You see, that's the issue. People become abundant. I have to have a lot. No. You don't have to be attached to it. That's what they would say. So I would talk about that for half the session, and then she would come in and talk about the decluttering aspects. And that's where I learned about, organize first. And of course, everybody wanted to hear more than me. But, how do I come in and I get rid of these things? There was something else I was going to say in that, and I don't remember that. But back to this expression. So touch it if it gives you joy. All right. So when that first came out, and there was a lot of attention about the new Netflix series and all these things, news reporters, people interested in the field like yourself, contacted me and said, what do you think about all this? And I had heard of it, and I thought to myself, joy. Joy is different. Finally, a Japanese reporter contacts me and says, what do you think? And I said, I struggle with this notion of joy. And the reporter said, you're right. The actual expression is keep it if it makes you happy. And I said, because happy is a mood. Moods are different than emotions. Moods are temporary kind of thing. Joy is deeper. Again, going back to my Christian notions here, we sing at Christmas time, joy to the world. We don't sing happiness to the world. Right? Because joy is deeper. All right. And so interesting. And as the reporter said, but it's been translated to joy because joy sells books. All right, I'll
Of
just leave it at
course.
that. Okay. So lack of ability. People said they don't know how to get rid of these things. Find a good friend, organize. Oh, I remember one of the other things. Okay. So sometimes people will say, yeah, but it may come back in style, or someday I may fit in it. Let's focus on the clothing, right? Well, let's be honest. You're really going to fit in this thing? You've been saying that for several years now. All right. We tend to go up, not down in life. And it may come back in style, and you're probably right. But that 1982 shirt that you have hanging in the closet will come back, but I'll bet you they're going to make it a little different now so that if you put on the 82 one, people will know that's from 82. She's wearing something old. He's wearing something old, And by the way, I tend to be female examples, and I want to let your listeners know there's no significant gender difference between male and female's clutter. When Roster and I started, the first study we did, we had 1,600 people who reported they had a clutter problem. But out of that over 1,600, only 80 of them were men. So I contacted. Yeah, and I thought, there's a gender difference. So again, we contacted the ICD leaders, and they said, no. We have male clients, but men don't see it as clutter. Men tend to see it as my toys, my stuff.
Interesting.
All right.
Yeah.
Culture tells women you got clutter. All right. But men, we don't say that. Fascinating to me. All right. And in fact, the new paper that we just wrote on e-waste, we looked at only in women in that sample to look at that. So go ahead.
Going back to the coaches, the ICD coaches that you mentioned. Yes, ICD. So how effective do you think having coaches around a person who clutters is in the grand scheme of things for the long term? Because do they impart skills to a point that one is self-sufficient enough to actually deal with the problem later on down the line? Or is it just a quick fix solution? This is what I'm interested to know.
No. Yes, that's a great question. And when I get this, I'd like to send it to them so they can use, because when I go to this conference this weekend, they have classes. They have 3, maybe it's 4. They have different levels of training that they get. These people aren't just anybody off the street. They're certified, and they have different levels of certification. And in each of those certifications, they're learning more and more ways to teach their clients on how to sustain decluttering once they leave. So you're absolutely right. They don't just come in and say, here's a quick fix, one and done. They leave the person with life skills. Like a life coach. These are not necessarily therapists. Some of them that I've met, many have a bachelor's degree, but they're not, clinical psychologists. They come from a variety of skills. They love organizing and helping people do these things. They really do. And so they're skilled in all of this kind of stuff. That's a great question. That one I can answer. They don't just leave you. They teach you. And I know it sounds like a shameless plug for them, but I think I just watched in 12 years, going to their conferences and having my students present like the one who's going to be doing. It's just great to see their commitment to this and their love for making people's lives better off, and all the techniques that they use.
First-hand witness, so that's inspiring stuff to hear, and it's very encouraging to know that there are people really helping the community, and it's wonderful.
Yeah, be careful of make sure that's why I want your listeners to know, make sure they're ICD certified, because I have met other people who said, I'm a decluttering coach, here's my cards, here's my paraphernalia, they have their fancy names, but they're not members of the ICD group.
Yes.
And this is just my bias. Now you're Deacon Joe. Bias is I'd rather have somebody who's been screened, because I think they take tests, they have to pass certain, I want someone who knows what they're doing than somebody who's just been doing it.
Yeah. Deacon Joe, is there a generational difference in the way that you're seeing clutter being accumulated?
That's what one of my, actually with e-waste, that's what my new master's student, she's beginning to look at, Generation X, Y versus boomers. The problem, or the possible, as we say in science, confound with that would be if I'm a boomer, I'm older than a Generation Z. Well, if I'm older, I've been around longer, so I can have more time to buy stuff. So if I have more stuff, is it because I'm a clutterer or because I've had the opportunity to get more possessions. You see what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
You'd have to be able to control for that. But I think the question, another way of asking your question is, what's the difference between minimalists and people who are clutterers? Don't know the answer. And any listener out there, there's your research study to do if you're into science. Are minimalists, their personalities, their lifestyles, their sense of home, whatever, different than people who are with a clutter issue?
Well, I take my own personal case, Deacon Joe, because I come from a family that enjoy collecting, acquiring, and I am the complete antithesis, the opposite of that. I am a minimalist in the true sense of the word. So I am the voice of reason, usually going to the family members and telling them, why are you keeping this? We have to clear the space. It makes you feel good. But I remember going back to childhood. The way that clutter made me feel, which was obviously negative, was the ultimate motivation to actually declutter.
Okay.
So I just remember that clutter didn't make me feel good. And based on that, I was able to move forward and do what was necessary. And it was a habit that just stuck over time, I guess. Okay. So yeah, it is very interesting.
There's two things I'd like to comment on. One is a comment, one is a question for you. These relatives, friends, family with collections. You see, they don't see it as clutter. They see it as my collection of spoons, my collections of whatever it might be. And that's what we found that's what we hear with men. These are my collections of sporting events. These are my collections of left-handed shoes of different people. I don't know, whatever their collection could be.
Sure.
So we call it collection, not clutter. And going back to your dynamic in your family situations, were there conflicts when you would turn them and say, "Do we really need to keep this?" Did that cause a conflict? Did tension arise?
Yes, most definitely. I mean, at times.
And that goes back to what I said earlier. So what would people say? So let's just avoid this possible conflict and not discuss it. And then the item stays. Yeah. So good.
Or when they left the house, one would take action.
Now they know. Now they know what happened to that thing.
They know the truth is out now. So.
25 years later, they learn, that's what happened to that thing. Okay. Let's see.
Deacon Joe, can you explain to us, just moving on, what are the behavioral effects of clutter? Can you go into more detail about that so that the audience have a clear understanding?
Lower life satisfaction, lower sense of home, more indecision, less higher place attachment. That's a social community psych concept. We attach to places. How do we form community? We find in the work setting, all right, because we looked at corporate workers and remote workers. I won't go through the studies. I'll just give you the things. Let's see. A lower pleasure from work. The more clutter, negatively related to work satisfaction, pleasure from work, positive related to burnout and tension. So the more clutter you have, the more tension you have, the more lower job performance, actually the word burnout for your listeners and for yourself, really about 30 years old. We don't use that anymore. The word, people know what that is, but you really use the word emotional exhaustion. That's probably the better word to use. Why? I don't know the field, but that's what they say. You shouldn't use the word burnout, but more emotional exhaustion. Lower time control on their life. And in the workplace, we asked people, which we hadn't done in the home, what are your 3 areas? Well, actually the top 5, but the top 3 areas where people have most clutter. What is that clutter that you have in the office? Paper was number 1, whether it's in the corporate setting or the home. So people have a lot of paper, which always makes me laugh because I'm old enough to remember when computers were becoming the rage. We were told, you'll have less paper. You won't need to do all that anymore. Well, no, what did people do? They printed out the message. They kept the message on paper. So now you had it on the computer and a hard copy as well. So paper depends in the corporate setting, equipment. So that means they have more, too many screens, too many wires, too many, desktops. In the home, it was trash, And for the office, trash was number 3. In other words, used coffee cups, styrofoam cups, that kind of stuff, napkins, all that stuff around. And then in the remote worker, office supplies, lots of post notes, too many post notes, too many piles of this or that. So, I invite the listener to look at what is the clutter. As a psychologist, I'm interested in who has the clutter, but I want to know what is the clutter? What is it that people have? And so there's so much more that can be discussed with all of this or explored with all of this.
Interesting. Yes.
Go
And
ahead.
so,
Yeah,
well, I'm very interested to know about as well the religious aspect of your work, because going back to your point about kind of imparting knowledge from your perspective, the first word that springs to mind is apatheia in ancient Greek, which is obviously related back to the wise virtue of the detachment, like this idea of wisdom and virtue, the highest forms of virtue being the detachment of possessions. So in relation to your teachings and dealing with the community, how do you channel your religious education to teach them to ease away from attachment of possessions generally?
Well, one thing I always tell them is look at the Hindu monk. The Hindu monk spends 7 years getting rid of everything except for 2 robes, 2 bowls, and 2 spoons. That's all they have. So it takes them 7 years. So this is not easy. There's no magic bullet here. As I said earlier, people are excuse makers. So your listeners are going to listen there and they're going to engage in what I call the but however kind of thing. Well, that was interesting, but for me, blah, 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 blah. Oh, that was it. However, in my case, blah, 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 blah. Right. So, people won't always listen to what we're saying here. But how do you tell people to detach from what they've got? When I would do these seminars, I would look at scripture. Yes. What does scripture say? Make a decision. Again, for your Christian listeners, remember Mary pondered when the angel came. She didn't procrastinate. Yes. She didn't delay. She pondered. She thought. So it's good to stop and think. And that's what even the ICD people would say. Organize first. Let that volume show you, wow. All right, not just got getting rid of. Well, something earlier you said that I think consider, do I need this object all the time? My presenter, I talked about, there was something that she uses only Thanksgiving time. We have a holiday here in the States called Thanksgiving, and she only needed it that time in November. So her sister or sisters would use it at other times. So they all bought one of it, some kitchen gadget, I don't remember what it was, and they would rotate it around. See? So I had it when I needed it, but I wouldn't need it other times. So consider those kinds of options. Do you need the object all the time? I'm not attached to it, except I know when I need it, I can get it. We have to be creative. One size doesn't fit all. I can't give you a cookbook solution and say, this is what you do. Be careful, listener, of anybody trying to do that, because you're you. And what works for you may not work for me or for anybody else. So there's a rule we say in psychology, going back to a guy named B.F. Skinner, take what the client gives you. In other words, you take what was relevant to that person. You don't come up with one solution. So all you can do is give lots of examples and let people try to do that. And life change takes time. There's a whole, but this in your mental health work, 4 to 6 months before change can happen. It's called process of change. So people expect to see it in 4 to 6 weeks. No, it's going to take 4 to 6 months. It's going to take longer for change. It takes time for change to happen. Create situations where the person is rewarded for each step as they make the change. Great. You spend time today, 2 hours, going through that messy drawer, and look, you got rid of half the items in there. That's great. Let's celebrate that. Now, tomorrow or the day after, we'll come back and we'll do the other half. Don't say, oh, you did half, but what about the other half? You see, catch them being good, another expression we like to say in psychology. Find something positive and build on that. Yeah, and don't force people. There's a concept, do you know about the concept of psychological reactance?
Yes, please explain that in more detail.
Sure. This has been around since the 60s, and it's a concept. I'm from outside of Chicago here, and so a major city, and I grew up in New York, another major city. So we would call it here the oh yeah effect. And that's what it used to be called too. Reactance is a situation where when someone is willing to do something, they're going to do it, but now you impose it on them. They do the, oh yeah? Well, just for that, I'm not going to do it. All right. So they react against it. And this literature, as I said, back in the 60s, was on smoking and indoors. Originally, they found if you had public announcements of please don't smoke in the building, people would go, oh yeah, just for that I'm going to. How dare you tell me I can't? What is this? So we have found in business settings that thank you posters are much more effective than please don't posters. Telling people, please don't do something is not going to be, because you're going to get reactance, is much less likely to work than saying, thank you for not. Thank you for not smoking. Thank you for not littering. That's going to be more effective because it builds on guilt. Because people feel, I better pick that up. Oh God, no. What if somebody saw me? All right. So be careful of reactance effects. When you start imposing, you got a kid, because I had a high school student. We did research on bedroom clutter among adolescents. And when parents say, you got to empty that closet, the kid's going to do what? Oh, yeah? Just for that, Mom? I ain't going to do it. I would have done that later, but just for that, I ain't going to do it. So you got to be careful of reactance, the oh, yeah effect, if you would.
Of course, that makes a very, very valid point.
All right. You asked earlier about the types of declutterers.
Sure. Let's go back to that. Yeah.
Okay. So this was the Roster and Ferrari 2023 articles, the last one we did, coming out in the Journal of Consumer Affairs. So we had a number of people who completed our measures during COVID. All right, we found that there are three kinds of declutterers. One group we called the disengaged. In other words, they were, because what we did, by the way, is ask people, what projects are you working on? There's a small body of literature in psychology on personal projects by Brian Little from the 80s. He looked at when people report, what are you working on? And then you evaluate those. And what we found was the disengaged, all right, they will declutter, but they find the project of low enjoyment and they feel they have little control over whatever the project is. So they're disengaged. On the other end was the enthusiastic declutterer. Well, they find the projects very enjoyable. They're absorbed by it. They believe it reflects who they are. They're low stress, lots of control, lots of time to do it. And in between these two, the disengaged and the enthusiastic, were the challenged declutterers. They find the project's meaningful, highly meaningful, but I don't enjoy it. And it's high stress. Yet I have the time and I have the control. So, I have to do this and I want to do this, but it's not something. So not all declutterers are the same. And so there's different types, and that's kind of interesting. And look at the 2020 listener, look at the 2023 article if you want to follow it up.
We will definitely do so. And how does too much clutter affect quality of life? Do you have any real life examples?
Well, low resources of money, how does it affect your quality? You spent all the money on these objects and not on other things you might need. You made the wants. I would say that's one way. It causes conflict, perhaps, because now you bought another one of those things, whatever they may be. And your partner, the person in your home or your life or business, says we have yet another one of these. So it can cause conflicts. It can cause financial impact. It can, you think it's making you happy, but it's not. Those will be the things that I said earlier.
So related to the space, so much of our energy is taken from our environment. Do you think there is enough being said, perhaps to the younger generations, about the importance of respecting one's space, how clarity is important in the space for one to increase productivity? Do you think there is enough information out there at this moment in time? Or do you think people are still somehow consumed by their consumerism behavior? And that is primarily the focus, and it kind of detracts from the importance of the home and the importance of environment.
I think what's happening is people are collecting relics and relationships are damaging. I always say, don't collect relics, collect relationships, all right? Create memories and moments. Don't just collect material things. So I think there is some truth to what you're saying, in that people are more and more today. We have these images of to make I said this earlier too, what will make you happy is having this object, this thing, going this place, doing that thing, and letting everybody know that you were there through your social media. I wonder, are we really becoming more sociable, or is it just lots of media?
Absolutely.
A takeaway for your listener is what I like to talk about is the rose. Look at a rose. A rose, ask yourself as you're trying to declutter, what would be the one thing I can declutter? That's your rose. What's the thorn?
Sure.
Because roses have thorns. What's the one thing you still need to declutter? And what's the bud? What's the new thing that will emerge as you declutter? So think of a rose with its thorns and the buds. All right. What is it that you're going to work on? What do you still have to do? That's the thorn. And what's going to emerge out of this? What's the new thing that will grow? And I'd like to leave your listener with those kinds of concepts.
Fantastic. Do we have any more practical tips to conquer clutter for our listeners? Any additional points?
Yeah. Again, as the ICP people would say, don't run out and buy containers. Instead, organize. Let that empower you. Be more organized. Keep it if it's going to give you happiness. Sure. If you're really going to make you happy, you need that. You don't have to get rid of everything. Maybe you can keep some items, but it's a question of abundance. Do you need so much of this? And don't become so attached that it interferes with who you are and your calling with a higher power, if you would. That's the bigger issue. Don't put material things above people. That would be my other advice.
Very, very important advice. But what about also dealing with a person who has this issue? You're cohabitating with that person. You're encountering issues on a daily basis. What is the first step to take with this individual to make progress on the front of declutter?
Yeah, I'm not a clinician, so these are clinical kinds of questions in terms of how do you deal with couple relationships, partnership relationships. And I'm not a clinician, a family therapist, so I don't know necessarily, except, you've got to dance around that, if you would, sometimes. Raise the issue when the time is right. Don't necessarily, these would be my practical advice, but I could be wrong. I'm not a clinician. I would say don't pressure the person. Celebrate what they do. My wife will tell me I don't do enough of that. When she does declutter, she was an elementary teacher for 40 years. She brought home over 66 boxes of teaching material. Yeah. So she went through a lot of it. She's gotten rid of a lot. There's still some boxes that are there. I've eased up now. I haven't counted how many are less. Maybe a dozen, maybe less, or that we still have. I could harp on her and say, still got a dozen. You retired 3 years ago. Or celebrate, she got rid of over 50. And that's hard. This has been your lifestyle. I know I'm retiring someday soon. And it's hard to get rid of the things that you've created. She was a darn good teacher. And she was an award-winning teacher. So you have to celebrate the wins. Small wins, we call them in psychology. Celebrate the small steps that the person has. And but doesn't mean just stop there. Encourage them to go through it again. And so,
do you think
she likes to go through these boxes while we're watching television. All right, a little multitask. So that's great strategy. Combine something pleasurable that you like to do with something that's not so pleasurable.
Oh, that's very smart.
Yeah.
Very important advice. Deacon Joe, it's been such a pleasure to have you with us on Mental Wealth. Thank you so much for your time and your very valuable insights. And we look forward to speaking with you again, hopefully, in the near future to discuss your research and your work moving forward. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you for including me. I wish the listeners, I hope we gave you at least a couple of pearls that you can take with you.
Of course.
You move forward in life. So live long and prosper, as they say, and be in touch. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. If you found today's topic interesting and want to hear more from us, please subscribe to our podcast and share the link. We have so much more to talk about, so stay tuned for more information on upcoming episodes on our mentalwealth.me podcast.